Hi guys, today we are going to discuss a topic that sits right at the intersection of ancient history, forgotten texts, and one of the most enduring mysteries humanity has ever carried with it. The story of the Anunnaki and the shadowy conflicts that echo through the earliest written records of civilization. If you've ever wondered why the world's first cities appeared almost suddenly in the floodplains of Mesopotamia, if you've ever questioned why the Sumerians wrote about gods who ruled like kings, fought like generals, and issued decrees like bureaucrats, if you've ever felt that there is something strange about how abruptly advanced civilization seems to have emerged, then what you're about to hear will stay with you. Because long before Rome, before Egypt, before the pyramids and the pharaohs, there was Sumer. And Sumer left behind something no other ancient civilization did, a written record of its own beginnings. Not myths passed down orally, not legends reshaped by centuries of retelling, but thousands upon thousands of clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped symbols that still exist today in museum vaults around the world. These tablets tell us who ruled. They tell us when cities were built. They tell us how food was rationed, how laws were enforced, how canals were dug, and they also tell us something else. They tell us that the first rulers of humanity were not human. They were called the Anunnaki. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not distant, abstract gods in the sky. They were physical beings who came to Earth, who established cities, who owned land, who demanded labor, and who made decisions that shaped the destiny of the human race. They lived among humans, ruled over them, and according to the tablets, they fought among themselves. And this is where the mystery begins, because when we line up the oldest Sumerian and Akkadian texts, something disturbing emerges. The Anunnaki were not united. They were divided into factions, they argued, they conspired, they rebelled, and eventually, according to the texts, they unleashed forces that devastated the very civilization they had created. Tonight, we are going to begin a long journey through these ancient records. We are going to follow the trail left behind by scribes who lived more than 5,000 years ago. We are going to listen to their voices, preserved in clay, as they describe events that sound less like mythology and more like the chronicles of a lost age. An age when gods walked on earth. An age when cities were ruled by beings who lived for thousands of years. An age that ended in catastrophe. Let's begin at the beginning. Sumer arose in southern Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This land was harsh. It had almost no stone, almost no timber, and very little metal. It flooded unpredictably, turning farmland into marsh and then into desert. By all logic, it should have been one of the worst places on Earth to build a civilization. And yet, around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Small farming villages suddenly became large cities. Cities became city-states. Walls, temples, irrigation canals, and complex administrations appeared. Writing emerged. Mathematics emerged. Astronomy emerged. Law codes emerged. This didn't happen slowly over thousands of years. It happened fast, so fast that archaeologists still struggle to explain it. The Sumerians themselves had an answer. They said they were taught. In their language, the word Anunnaki means those who from heaven came to earth. These beings, the tablets say, descended from the sky and established the first cities. They appointed kings. They laid out the canals. They organized labor. They taught humans how to farm, how to build, how to write, and how to worship. Every major Sumerian city had a patron god who physically resided there. Enki lived in Eridu, Enlil ruled from Nippur. Inanna reigned in Uruk. Nanna governed Udu ruled Sippar. These were not symbolic gods. They had houses, they had temples, they had estates, they had servants, and they demanded offerings from human workers. The tablets describe them eating, drinking, marrying, having children, and issuing commands. They were not invisible spirits, they were rulers, and the Sumerians recorded their reigns just as carefully as they recorded the reigns of later human kings. This brings us to one of the most important documents ever discovered, the Sumerian king list. This text exists in multiple copies, all telling the same story. It lists every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of time down to the scribes who copied it. It begins with a strange and powerful statement. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In other words, kingship did not originate with humans, it came from above. The king list then names 8 rulers who governed 5 cities before a great flood. Their reigns are measured not in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another ruled for 36,000, another for 43,200. These are not human lifespans, and yet the king list records them in the same matter-of-fact tone it uses to record later kings who ruled for 30 or 40 years. There is no distinction between divine and human. It simply states who ruled, where they ruled, and for how long. Then the text says something simple and terrifying. Then the flood swept over. After that, everything changes. Kingship is lowered from heaven again, but this time it goes to Kish, and the kings that follow live much shorter lives. Still long by modern standards, sometimes hundreds of years, but nothing like the impossible spans of the rulers before the flood. The implication is clear. Before the flood, the rulers were something else, not human, and the flood marked the end of their age. The flood story appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. The oldest version, called the Eridu Genesis, tells us that the gods decided to destroy humanity. The reason they give is chillingly mundane. Humans had become too many, too noisy, too disruptive. The god Enlil, lord of the atmosphere and storms, complained that he could no longer sleep because of the clamor of mankind. Cities had grown, fields had expanded, humanity was multiplying. So the divine council decided to wipe them out. But one god disagreed. His name was Enki. Enki was the god of wisdom, water, and creation. He had helped design humanity. He had helped bring them into existence, and when the council voted to destroy them, he secretly betrayed that decision. He did not confront the council directly. Instead, he whispered the truth through a reed wall to a human king named Ziusudra. Tear down your house, build a boat, save life. Ziusudra did as he was told. The flood came. The world was drowned, but a remnant survived. When Enlil discovered that humanity still lived, he was furious. But Enki argued that total destruction was wrong and that other methods could be used to control population. This moment matters because it marks the first recorded fracture in divine authority. One god had defied the others, and that fracture would never fully heal. From this point on, the Anunnaki are no longer a unified council. They are factions. Some favor strict control over humanity. Some favor cooperation. Some favor destruction, and those divisions begin to appear everywhere in the texts. We see them in the thefts of the Tablet of Destinies, the object that grants supreme authority over the cosmos. We see them in the rebellion of the Igigi, the lesser gods who refuse to continue doing forced labor. We see them in the violent descent of Inanna into the underworld, where she is killed by her own sister, Ereshkigal. The gods fight each other, they imprison each other, they steal power from each other. And through it all, humanity is caught in the middle. The Sumerians believed that humans were created to work for the gods, to dig canals, to grow food, to maintain temples, to keep the divine system running. But as humans multiplied and civilization expanded, that system became unstable. The more successful humanity became, the more it threatened the old order, and that is when things began to spiral. This is where our story truly begins, because what followed was not just myth. It was a long, bitter struggle for control, and according to the tablets, it ended in fire, wind, and the collapse of an entire world. And that is where everything truly started to go wrong. Because before humanity was ever meant to rule itself, before kings and empires and written law, there was already a war brewing among the gods themselves. To understand it, we have to go back even further than the flood, back to the very moment when humanity was first created. According to one of the oldest Mesopotamian epics ever discovered, the Atrahasis, the universe was already organized long before humans existed. The Anunnaki, the senior gods, ruled over heaven and earth. Beneath them were the Igigi, the younger gods who did the hard work that kept the world functioning. They dug canals, they dredged rivers, they piled up embankments, they labored in mud and water under the burning sun. This was not symbolic labor. The text describes aching exhaustion, blistered hands, and endless toil. For 40 years, the Igigi worked without rest, maintaining the irrigation systems that allowed the Anunnaki to enjoy the wealth of a fertile world. And then they broke. One night, the Igigi gathered in secret. They burned their digging tools. They marched on the house of Enlil, the god who commanded their labor. The text uses the word siege. This was not a polite protest. It was an armed revolt. Enlil panicked. He called an emergency meeting of the divine council. Anu, the sky god, Enki, the lord of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess, were summoned. The situation was explosive. If the Anunnaki tried to crush the rebellion, it could turn into a full-scale civil war among the gods. The Igigi made their case plainly. The labor was killing them. They demanded relief. The Anunnaki faced a choice. They could either fight the Igigi and risk destroying their own system, or they could find another way to maintain the world without divine labor. It was Enki who proposed the solution. Create a new being, not a god, not an Igigi, but something in between, a worker. Enki and Ninhursag mixed clay from the earth with the flesh and blood of a slain god, the leader of the Igigi rebellion. From this mixture they fashioned the first humans. The text is specific. It describes shaping, mixing, and bringing to life. Humans were designed to carry a portion of divine essence, enough to think and work, but not enough to challenge the gods. Humanity was created as a labor force, and at first it worked. Humans took over the canal digging, they planted fields, they tended herds, they built temples. The Igigi were freed from their toil and the crisis was temporarily resolved. But in solving one problem, the Anunnaki had created another. Humans multiplied, cities grew, noise filled the land. And the balance of power began to shift. From the perspective of Enlil, humanity had become a threat, too numerous, too independent, too loud. They were no longer just workers, they were becoming a civilization. That was when Enlil pushed for their destruction. The flood was meant to erase the experiment, but Enki refused to let that happen. And by saving humanity, Enki didn't just preserve a species. He created a permanent enemy within the divine hierarchy. Because from that moment on, humanity was no longer neutral. Humanity was Enki's faction, and Enlil knew it. After the flood, the gods re-established their rule. Cities were rebuilt, kings were appointed, temples rose again, but the old harmony was gone. Suspicion had taken its place. The divine council still met, but its decisions were no longer trusted. Power became something that had to be controlled, not shared. This is where the Tablet of Destinies enters the story. The Tablet of Destinies was not just a symbol. In Mesopotamian belief, it was the ultimate authority. Whoever possessed it had the right to command gods and fate itself. It was a legal document, a cosmic decree, the very foundation of divine rule. Enlil held it, and that made him supreme, until it was stolen. A being called Anzu, a powerful servant of Enlil, seized the tablet and fled. With it, he could nullify Enlil's commands. The universe fell into chaos. The gods could no longer enforce their will. A war broke out to reclaim it. Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, eventually defeated Anzu and recovered the tablet, but the damage was done. Authority had been proven fragile. It could be taken, it could be lost. From that point forward, every god knew something dangerous. Power was no longer guaranteed. It had to be defended. And across the divine realms, tensions grew. In the heavens, on the earth, in the underworld. Inanna, the fierce goddess of love and war, attempted to expand her power by invading the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. She was stripped of her authority, killed, and hung like a corpse. Only Enki's intervention saved her. Once again, Enki broke the rules. Once again, he sided against the established order. And once again, the system survived, but barely. By the time human civilization reached its peak in Sumer, the gods were no longer just guardians. They were rivals. They were conspirators. They were enemies, and as humanity grew stronger, richer, and more complex, the cost of divine conflict grew with it. Because now every divine decision affected millions of human lives, and soon those lives would be caught in a war that no one could stop. That war would not come as a single battle. It would come as storms, as fire, as poisoned land, as cities abandoned by their gods. And it would leave behind a world so shattered that even the gods themselves would no longer remain. And so the stage was set. Humanity had been created to solve a divine crisis. The flood had failed to erase them. And now they were multiplying again, rebuilding cities, raising walls, digging canals, and filling the land with life and noise. From the divine perspective, the experiment had resumed, but this time it was different. This time the Anunnaki were divided. In the centuries after the flood, Mesopotamia entered what later historians would call the Golden Age of Sumer. Cities like Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash flourished. Trade networks stretched from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. Writing was refined. Law codes were written. Mathematics and astronomy developed. To humans, this was progress. To the Anunnaki, it was a pressure cooker because every city belonged to a god. Each temple was not just a religious site. It was an administrative headquarters. It owned land, managed labor, collected offerings, and controlled economic production. Each god had their own domain, their own workforce, their own political power. And just like human empires, these divine domains competed. Uruk belonged to Inanna, belonged to Nana. Nippur was Enlil's sacred city. Eridu was Enki's, and the gods did not rule these places as equals. Enlil claimed supremacy over the surface of the earth. Enki governed the subterranean waters and the hidden knowledge. Inanna pushed for expansion and conquest. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld. This was not a unified government, it was a fragile alliance. The Sumerian texts describe divine councils, but they also describe divine politics. Decisions were negotiated, alliances formed, betrayals occurred, and into this volatile system humanity was growing more powerful. Human kings began to rule large territories, they commanded armies, they controlled resources, they claimed divine favor and in some cases divine blood. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human. Whether symbolic or literal, the claim reveals something important. Human rulers were beginning to see themselves as more than servants. They were becoming players, and that made the gods nervous. The Sumerian texts begin to show a shift in tone during this period. Early writings describe humans as obedient workers. Later texts show humans pushing boundaries, seeking immortality, defying gods, building walls to protect themselves not just from enemies, but from divine wrath. The Epic of Gilgamesh is filled with this tension. Gilgamesh challenges the gods. He kills Humbaba, a divine guardian. He seeks eternal life. He refuses to accept the limits imposed on mortals, and the gods respond with punishment. Enkidu dies, immortality is denied, human ambition is crushed, but the pattern is clear. Humanity is no longer passive, it is pushing back, and in a system already strained by divine factionalism, this was dangerous. Then something else began to happen. Cities started to fail. Around 2300 BCE, the Akkadian Empire rose under Sargon of Akkad. For the first time, one human ruler controlled most of Mesopotamia. This was unprecedented. Sargon claimed divine backing, but he ruled as a human emperor, not as a god. To the Anunnaki, this was a red flag. Human political power was consolidating. The old city-state system, where each god controlled their own domain, was being replaced by a human empire. And that empire was not loyal to any single god. This was intolerable. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian text written after the empire's fall, describes how Enlil turned against Sargon's dynasty. It says the gods withdrew their protection. Enemies were summoned. Famine and chaos followed, but the text also describes something more. It speaks of fields that would not grow, of canals that dried up, of lands that turned to dust, of a curse that made the city vanish from the earth. Akkad was destroyed so completely that even later generations could not find it. This was not just political collapse, it was annihilation, and it wasn't the only one. By around 2200 to 2000 BCE, the entire Sumerian world began to collapse. Cities were abandoned, trade networks broke, populations fell. The Sumerian language itself disappeared from everyday speech. The Lamentation texts written during this period are heartbreaking. They describe gods leaving their cities, temples falling silent, people dying in their homes, fire in the streets, winds that carried death. They speak of something called the evil wind, a force that spread across the land, killing people and animals alike. They speak of heat that scorched people without flame. They speak of dust clouds rising where great cities once stood. This was not a normal war. This was not just invasion. This was something that changed the environment itself. The gods, the texts say, ordered it. They abandoned their cities. They withdrew to the mountains. They let destruction come. Why? Because the system had broken. Humanity had grown too strong. The gods had grown too divided, and the old order could no longer hold. Some Anunnaki wanted to rule humanity forever. Some wanted to withdraw. Some wanted to erase it and start again. And when those factions clashed, the earth paid the price. The weapons they used are never described in clear technical terms, but the effects are written in painful detail. Land poisoned, water undrinkable, animals fleeing, fields sterile for years. These are not metaphors for swords and spears. These are descriptions of something that changed the land itself. After this catastrophe, something remarkable happened. The gods stopped ruling directly. Human kings still claimed divine favor, but no god walked the streets of Ur or Uruk anymore. The temples remained, but the living presence was gone. The Anunnaki had left. Whether they were destroyed, driven away, or simply withdrew, the result was the same. Humanity was alone, and the world that emerged afterward was not the same one that had existed before. And this is where the ancient record takes on a haunting new tone. Because after the destruction of Sumer, after the cities burned, after the gods withdrew and humanity was left to rebuild on its own, the survivors did something very strange. They began to watch the sky, not in a casual, poetic way, but with obsessive precision. The Babylonians and their Sumerian predecessors created one of the most advanced astronomical systems in the ancient world. They mapped the stars, they tracked the planets, they recorded the movement of the moon with astonishing accuracy. They predicted eclipses centuries before anyone else on Earth could. Why? Because they believed the sky was a warning system. They believed the heavens had spoken before, and when they spoke, the world had ended. The omen texts, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, are among the largest bodies of technical writing in the ancient world. These were not myths. They were manuals used by professional diviners employed by kings. Their job was to read signs in the sky, on the earth, and in human bodies, and to warn rulers when catastrophe was coming. Among these omen texts, one category stands out as especially dark: the eclipse omens. These tablets describe exactly what will happen if the moon is darkened in a particular way on a particular day in a particular part of the sky. The predictions are brutally specific. A king will die, a city will be destroyed, a dynasty will fall, Elam will be wiped out. Akkad will suffer ruin. These are not vague warnings. They name real places. They name real outcomes. Why would ancient scholars believe that eclipses could predict such events? The standard answer is superstition. But superstition does not usually produce systems this detailed, this carefully preserved, and this heavily funded for over 1,000 years. The Babylonian state paid astronomers to observe the heavens every single night. They recorded every eclipse, every planetary movement, every unusual phenomenon. They compared them to past disasters and wrote down the correlations. They believed they were seeing patterns, and those patterns came from something that had happened before, something so traumatic that it burned itself into cultural memory. The destruction of Sumer, the fall of Akkad, the disappearance of divine rule. To the people who lived through that age, it must have felt like the end of the world. They never wanted it to happen again, so they watched the sky for signs, and what they were afraid of was not just war. They were afraid of the return of the gods, because if the Anunnaki had once destroyed the world, they could do it again. This fear is embedded in Mesopotamian prayers from the first millennium BCE. The gods are no longer spoken of as benevolent rulers. They are distant, unpredictable, and dangerous. How long, O my God, will you remain angry? Why have you turned your face away? Do not bring the storm again. These are not the words of people who believe their gods are gentle protectors. These are the words of survivors. And now let's return to the strange references in the older texts: the evil wind, the fire that consumes without flame, the stones of divine power, the weapons that had to be purified before use. These appear again and again across different genres of literature, not in one myth, not in one city, but across centuries and cultures. The Lugal-E describes stones that are cursed or blessed based on their behavior in a divine war. Some stones are said to purify water, others are said to poison it. Some emit light, others are dangerous to touch. The Era epic describes weapons so destructive that they must be carefully maintained by divine craftsmen. Their mere neglect causes catastrophe. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes divine radiance so powerful it terrifies and can kill. The Lamentation texts describe heat and wind that kills indiscriminately and leaves the land barren. Mainstream scholars say this is all metaphor, but the survivors who wrote these texts did not treat it as metaphor. They treated it as memory. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. What if something real happened, not gods with magic powers, but beings with technology, beings who could manipulate the environment? Beings who could deploy weapons that Bronze Age humans could only describe as divine. If an advanced civilization existed before recorded history, if it collapsed in war, and if the survivors of that war became the gods of Sumerian mythology, then everything suddenly fits. The long lifespans of the pre-flood kings, the sudden rise of civilization, the flood, the divine wars, the environmental catastrophe around 2000 BCE, the disappearance of the gods, it would all be part of one story. A story of advanced beings who ruled early humanity, fought among themselves, nearly destroyed the world, and then vanished. Whether you believe this or not, the ancient Mesopotamians certainly believed something like it, because they never wrote that their gods were imaginary. They wrote that their gods left, and that is a very different thing. After the catastrophe, the relationship between gods and humans changed forever. No god ruled directly. No god sat on a throne in a temple and issued daily orders. Kings became more independent, law became more human, religion became more distant, the Anunnaki became myth, but myth often begins as memory. And in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, that memory is still there, waiting, and it is here at the edge of divine departure that the ancient story grows even more unsettling. Because when the Anunnaki withdrew, they did not simply fade into legend, they left traces. The Mesopotamian texts describe something like a relocation. The gods did not die, they did not vanish into nothingness. They went to what the scribes called the mountain, the heavens, or the far places. These terms appear again and again in the post-catastrophe literature. In the Lamentations, the gods are described as abandoning their temples and flying away like birds. They refuse food and offerings, which in Mesopotamian religion meant they were no longer present to receive them. A god who did not eat or drink offerings was not there. But they were still alive, they were simply elsewhere. This distinction matters, because in Mesopotamian belief, gods who were dead did not act. Gods who had left could still influence events, send omens, and communicate through dreams. And the scribes believed that was exactly what the Anunnaki were still doing. After 2000 BCE, divine messages continued. Dreams were interpreted, omens were read, oracles were consulted, but direct divine rule was gone. It was as if a governing class had withdrawn to an off-world capital, or a remote fortress, or another realm. The kings of Babylon and Assyria still prayed to Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and Marduk, but these gods were no longer neighbors. They were distant authorities, and this is where the idea of heaven changes. In early Sumerian texts, heaven is not a spiritual paradise. It is a place, a realm where gods live, where they have houses, councils, and assemblies. It is physically separated from the earth but connected. The phrase "from heaven to earth they came" is literal. After the catastrophe, heaven becomes remote, unreachable. The ladder has been pulled up. The Anunnaki still exist, but humanity cannot reach them anymore. And that, more than anything, marks the end of the old world, because the old world was one where gods and humans shared space. The new world is one where they do not, and this change is mourned. The Lamentations do not celebrate the gods' departure. They grieve it. They describe cities left defenseless. They describe people abandoned. They describe a world that has lost its guardians. From the Sumerian point of view, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki was not liberation, it was exile. Humanity had been cut off from its creators. So what happened to them? The texts never say directly, but there are clues. In later Mesopotamian cosmology, there are multiple divine realms, the heavens above, the underworld below, the distant mountain, the cosmic sea. The Anunnaki are often associated with the heavens and the underworld. In some texts, the Anunnaki are described as judges in the realm of the dead. In others, they are heavenly rulers. This suggests a division. Some of them went below, some of them went above, and this division mirrors their political divisions. Enki is associated with the subterranean waters. Ereshkigal rules the underworld. Enlil and Anu are sky gods. When the final catastrophe occurred, each faction may have retreated to its own domain. Inanna's cult continued in Uruk, Enlil remained worshipped in Nippur. Enki was honored in Eridu, but none of them were physically present anymore. They were like distant lords ruling from afar. This is where the memory of direct contact ends, and this is where humanity truly enters its own age. But the ancient scribes never forgot. They kept copying the old stories. They kept writing the names. They kept preserving the records of divine wars, betrayals, and catastrophes. Because for them, this was not ancient mythology. It was history. History of a time when gods ruled, and of a time when gods destroyed the world. Now let's step back and look at what we actually have in front of us. We have thousands of clay tablets, many of which are still untranslated. They sit in museum basements in London, Philadelphia, Berlin, and Baghdad. Scholars estimate that only about 20% of all discovered cuneiform tablets have been fully translated. That means the story is not finished. Every year, new fragments are identified, new texts are read, new connections are made, and sometimes they reveal something unexpected. We find references to ancient kings that were thought to be mythical, only to discover their cities really existed. We find flood stories older than the Bible. We find astronomical data that matches modern calculations. This means one thing: the scribes were careful. They did not make things up lightly. When they wrote something, they meant it. So when they wrote about divine councils, divine wars, divine weapons, and divine catastrophes, they were not trying to entertain. They were trying to preserve memory. Whether that memory is literal or symbolic is still debated, but it is memory all the same. And that brings us to the final, haunting question. If the Anunnaki were real and if they left, could they return? The Mesopotamians believed they could. That is why the omens existed. That is why eclipses were feared. That is why kings constantly sought divine favor. They believed the gods were watching. They believed the sky was a doorway. They believed that what had happened once could happen again. And that fear shaped civilization for thousands of years. And if the Anunnaki had plans for humanity, then the most unsettling question of all becomes unavoidable. What were those plans? To understand that, we have to return to the way the Sumerians understood their own existence. In their worldview, humans were not created for freedom, happiness, or spiritual growth. They were created to work. The word used in Akkadian and Sumerian texts is dulu, labor, service, obligation. Humans were built to maintain the gods' world, dig the canals, plant the barley, raise the animals, build the temples. Humanity was the engine that kept the divine system running. And even after the gods withdrew, that purpose remained embedded in culture. Temples continued to dominate economies. Priests still managed land. Kings still ruled in the name of gods who were no longer physically present. The system survived without its creators. But did the Anunnaki intend it to? Some texts suggest they did. One of the most mysterious concepts in Mesopotamian religion is the me, the divine decrees or powers that govern everything from kingship to weaving, from war to music, from truth to deception. These were not abstract ideas. They were described as tangible objects or laws that could be given, taken, or stolen. In one famous story, Inanna visits Enki and takes the me from him, carrying them to Uruk. With these powers, she turns her city into a cultural and political powerhouse. This tells us something critical. The gods did not just rule by force. They ruled by knowledge. They had systems. They had laws. They had technologies of governance. And they shared some of them with humans: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, law. These were not invented gradually according to Sumerian tradition. They were given, so when the Anunnaki withdrew, they left behind a fully functioning civilization toolkit. Humanity was no longer dependent on them to survive. And that may have been intentional, because after the catastrophe of 2000 BC, we see something remarkable. Civilization doesn't end, it transforms. Babylon rises, Assyria rises, Persia rises, human empires replace divine city-states. Human kings replace god kings, the world becomes human. From one perspective, this looks like progress. From another, it looks like a controlled transition. What if the Anunnaki realized that their direct rule was no longer sustainable? That their internal conflicts were too dangerous, that their presence was destabilizing the planet? What if their final war forced them to withdraw, but they made sure humanity would survive without them? If that were the case, then the gods did not abandon humanity. They graduated it, but this raises another disturbing possibility. What if they did not leave permanently? What if they only stepped back? Some Mesopotamian texts hint at future returns. Gods are described as sleeping, as waiting, as watching. The sky remains their domain. The stars remain their signs. The idea that heaven is a place of return persists through later religions. Angels descend, gods appear, messengers come. The memory of divine contact never disappears. It just changes form. And that brings us back to the modern world, because the same questions that haunted the Sumerians still haunt us. Where did civilization really come from? Why did it appear so suddenly? Why are the oldest stories filled with gods who behave like advanced rulers? Why do so many ancient cultures speak of a golden age before a great catastrophe? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why do so many ancient traditions speak of the gods returning? Whether you see the Anunnaki as literal beings, symbolic archetypes, or forgotten rulers of a lost age, their story reflects something deeply human. We remember a time when the world was different. We remember a time before the fall. And we are still searching for what was lost. And when we widen our view beyond Mesopotamia, something extraordinary happens. The story stops being local. It becomes global. Because the Sumerians were not the only ancient people who remembered a time when gods ruled, when a great catastrophe destroyed the old world, and when survivors rebuilt under a new order. The same pattern appears again and again in cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. Ancient Egypt, the earliest records speak of a time called Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled the land directly. Osiris, Horus, Thoth, Isis, these were not spiritual abstractions. They were kings. They ruled Egypt before the pharaohs. They fought wars. They governed cities. They established law. After a great conflict, Horus defeats Seth and the gods withdraw. After that, human pharaohs rule, claiming to be descendants of the gods rather than gods themselves. The structure is the same. Gods rule. They fight, a catastrophe occurs, they withdraw, humans take over. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec recorded previous ages of the world that were destroyed by fire, flood, wind, and earthquakes. Each age ended in catastrophe. Each age was ruled by gods. We are in the fifth world, according to their tradition. The one that came after the others were destroyed. In Hindu cosmology, there are yugas, ages of the world. Each age ends in collapse. Gods walk among humans in the early ages. In the later ages, they withdraw. In Greek mythology, there was a golden age ruled by the Titans and the Olympian gods. It ended in a war in heaven, the Titanomachy. After that, the gods became more distant and humanity entered a lesser age. In the Book of Enoch, ancient watchers descend from heaven, rule over humans, take wives, teach forbidden knowledge, and eventually trigger a catastrophe that leads to the flood. Afterward, they are punished and removed from the world. The pattern is everywhere. A time of divine presence, a time of divine conflict, a catastrophe, a withdrawal, a new human age. Is this coincidence, or is it the echo of something that really happened? When independent cultures preserve the same story structure, it suggests a shared memory or a shared experience. And that brings us back to the Anunnaki, because if they were not just a local myth, but part of a wider phenomenon, then the Mesopotamian texts may not be describing isolated gods. They may be describing one branch of a global civilization that once ruled the earth, a civilization that was lost, a civilization remembered as gods. If that were true, then the flood was not just a local disaster, it was a global reset, and the catastrophe around 2000 BCE was not just Mesopotamia. It was the last echo of a much older war. The Sumerians were not the first to lose the gods, they were just the ones who wrote it down. And now, thousands of years later, we are still finding their records, still reading their warnings, still trying to understand what they were trying to tell us. Because if the Anunnaki were once here and if they left, then the most important question is not whether they existed. It is whether they are truly gone, and that question has never stopped haunting humanity. From ancient prayers to modern UFO sightings, the sky has always been watched, because deep down we remember something. Something that came from above, something that ruled, something that left, and something that might return. And so the ancient story does not fade when the last clay tablet is pressed, when the last Sumerian scribe lays down his stylus, or when the last temple door closes. It continues forward, threading itself into the modern world in ways that are subtle, strange, and impossible to ignore once you begin to see them. Because if the Anunnaki were not simply symbols, but once-present powers that withdrew, then the memory of their presence would not disappear. It would transform, it would adapt, it would emerge again and again in new forms. And that is exactly what we see. Every age has its gods, every age has its visitors from the sky, every age has its watchers. In ancient times they were called Anunnaki, watchers, Elohim, Apkallu, Titans. In later ages they became angels, devas, shining ones, messengers. In our age they are called something else, but the pattern remains: lights in the sky, beings descending, knowledge given, warnings delivered, humanity observed. For thousands of years, people have reported encounters with beings that do not belong to this world. They describe figures who arrive in craft that move silently through the air, who emit light, who speak without words, who show visions of past and future, who warn of environmental destruction, who seem concerned with humanity's development and survival. If you strip away the modern language, the technology, the science fiction framing, what remains is eerily familiar. It is the same story told in Sumer. Beings from above, advanced knowledge, concern about humanity's growth, fear of catastrophe, and the sense that something greater is watching. The Sumerians believed the Anunnaki watched humanity from heaven after they left. The Babylonians believed the gods sent signs through the stars. The Egyptians believed the gods returned in different forms. The Greeks believed the Olympians still lived beyond the mortal realm. We never stopped believing that something was out there. We just changed the names. And now, in the modern age, the ancient questions have returned with new urgency. Where did we come from? Are we alone? Is someone watching us? Has someone guided us before? When scientists look at the sudden emergence of complex civilization in Sumer, it still does not fit a smooth evolutionary curve. Writing appears fully formed, mathematics appears advanced, astronomy appears precise, architecture appears sophisticated. This is not how most human innovations develop. They usually start small, they grow slowly, but Sumer appears like a spark, as if something was lit. And when that spark went out, the world fell into chaos. The Bronze Age collapse around 2000 BCE was not a single event. It was a cascade. Climate changed, cities fell, trade routes broke, populations collapsed, languages died, cultures disappeared, the world reset. And from that reset emerged the civilizations we recognize today. The Anunnaki vanished from direct contact, but humanity survived, which brings us back to Enki, the god who saved humanity from extinction. The god who broke divine law, the god who favored humans. Enki is remembered as the trickster, the teacher, the giver of knowledge. He is the one who told Ziusudra to build the boat. He is the one who helped Inanna escape death. He is the one who created humans in the first place. If there was any Anunnaki who believed humanity should survive and thrive, it was Enki. And if any divine faction continued to care about humanity after the withdrawal, it would have been his. This is why Enki is so important. because he represents the possibility that humanity was not abandoned. It was protected, even from the other gods, and that idea echoes in later traditions. The serpent in the Garden of Eden who gives humans knowledge, Prometheus who steals fire from the gods, the Watchers who teach forbidden arts. These figures are always punished by higher authority, but they are remembered as humanity's benefactors. They are remembered as rebels, just like Enki. So what if the Anunnaki were not a single united force but competing powers? What if some wanted to dominate humanity while others wanted to help it evolve? What if the final war was not just about control of Earth but about the future of humanity itself? The Sumerian texts never say it directly, but they imply it again and again. And when the dust settled, humanity was left with knowledge, writing, math, astronomy, agriculture, law, everything needed to build civilization. It was as if the gods left us the tools and said, "Now it is your turn." But the ancient fear remained that if humanity grew too powerful, too numerous, too disruptive, the gods might return. That fear shaped religion, that fear shaped kingship, that fear shaped astronomy, and that fear in many ways still shapes us today, because when we look into the sky we still feel it, the same curiosity, the same awe, the same unease. And when something moves in ways we cannot explain, when lights cross the heavens in silence, when strange objects defy physics, we feel a deep ancient echo, as if something old is stirring. Whether you believe the Anunnaki were literal beings or symbolic rulers of a lost age or the memory of something humanity cannot yet fully understand, the story remains. A story of creation, a story of conflict, a story of catastrophe, a story of survival, and perhaps a story not yet finished. Because the ancient texts do not say the gods are gone forever, they say they are watching, and that may be the most unsettling part of all. The clay tablets are silent now, but their message endures. We were not alone in the beginning, and we may not be alone at the end. And as we move forward into the future, armed with technology that can reach the stars, perhaps we are finally becoming what the Anunnaki once were. A civilization that looks down on worlds, a civilization that shapes life. A civilization that must decide whether to rule, to guide, or to destroy. The ancient story may not be about gods at all, it may be about us. And as we stand at this strange crossroads of ancient memory and modern technology, the story takes on a new and unsettling resonance. Because for the first time since the fall of Sumer, humanity is no longer confined to the earth. We are watching the sky again. Not with naked eyes and clay tablets, but with satellites, telescopes, radio arrays, and probes that reach beyond the limits of our world. We track asteroids, we map galaxies, we search for signals. We listen for something, anything that might tell us we are not alone. And in doing so, we are unknowingly stepping into the same role the Anunnaki once occupied in the ancient imagination. We are becoming the Watchers. We are becoming the ones who descend, who observe, who intervene. And this is why the old stories matter. Because whether the Anunnaki were literal beings or symbolic representations of ancient power structures, the narrative they left behind is a warning about what happens when advanced beings interact with less advanced ones. It is a story about responsibility, about control, about rebellion, about unintended consequences. The Sumerian scribes did not describe their gods as perfect. They described them as flawed. They argued, they made mistakes. They overreacted, they punished too harshly, they regretted their decisions. These were not the distant, flawless deities of later theology. These were rulers with personalities, and rulers with personalities make choices that shape history. The flood was one of those choices, the withdrawal was another, and the catastrophe around 2000 BCE was the final one. From that moment on, humanity had no one to blame but itself, and yet the memory of divine oversight never disappeared. Even today, when we talk about artificial intelligence, about genetic engineering, about climate change, about world-ending technologies, the same themes arise. Who should be in control? Who decides what is allowed? What happens when power is abused? What happens when creation turns against creator? These are not modern questions, they are ancient ones. The Sumerians were asking them 5,000 years ago. They were asking them about the Anunnaki, and now we are asking them about ourselves. Because we are creating our own Anunnaki. We are building machines that think. We are altering life at the genetic level. We are reshaping the planet. We are developing weapons that can poison land for generations. We are reaching a point where our decisions will determine whether civilization survives or collapses, just like the gods of old. This is why the ancient story feels so eerily relevant. It is not just about what happened. It is about what happens when power exceeds wisdom. When knowledge outruns responsibility, when rulers, whether divine or human, forget the cost of their actions. The Sumerian Lamentations are not just records of disaster, they are warnings. They tell us what it looks like when a civilization falls apart from the inside, when environmental collapse, political conflict, and technological power combine into something unstoppable. They tell us what it feels like to watch the world end. And they tell us that survivors will always try to remember. Because memory is all that remains when everything else is gone. The scribes who wrote those laments were not trying to scare us. They were trying to make sure we did not forget. They had seen cities turn to dust. They had seen land made barren. They had seen gods abandon their people. They had seen the old world die. And they knew that if future generations did not understand what happened, it could happen again. So they wrote it in clay. They pressed their warnings into something that could last. And now, thousands of years later, we are reading them. We are trying to understand. And perhaps in doing so, we are being given a chance they never had. The chance to learn, the chance to avoid repeating the same mistakes. The chance to grow beyond the cycle of creation and destruction that seems to haunt every intelligent civilization. Because whether the Anunnaki were real beings or not, the story they left behind is a mirror. It reflects who we are, what we do with power, how we treat those who depend on us, how we respond to crisis, and whether we choose destruction or preservation. Enki chose preservation. He broke the rules to save humanity. He believed the experiment was worth continuing, and in many ways we are living proof that he was right. Because despite everything that has happened since the flood, since the collapse of Sumer, since the wars, plagues, and disasters of history, humanity is still here. We are still building. We are still learning. We are still reaching for the stars, and that may be the most powerful legacy of all, not the wars, not the catastrophes, but the survival. And as we move closer to the end of this long journey through ancient memory and modern reflection, we must ask one final question. What do we do with this story? Do we dismiss it as myth? Do we treat it as metaphor? Do we believe it as history? Or do we use it as a guide? Because no matter how you interpret the Anunnaki, their story tells us something essential. It tells us that intelligence brings responsibility, that creation brings consequence, and that every civilization, no matter how powerful, must choose between domination and stewardship. The gods of Sumer made their choice. Now humanity must make its own. And so we arrive at the final horizon of this long and winding story where ancient memory and modern destiny meet. Because the Anunnaki, whether they were flesh and blood beings, symbolic rulers, or something in between, left behind more than just ruined cities and broken temples. They left behind a narrative that still shapes how humanity understands itself. A narrative about origins, a narrative about power, a narrative about collapse, and most of all, a narrative about responsibility. The Sumerians believed their gods created them to serve, but through the conflicts of heaven, they became something more. They became independent. they became capable, they became the heirs of a broken world, and in a strange way, that is exactly where humanity stands today. We inherited a planet shaped by forces we did not create. We live in systems built by generations before us. We wield technologies that can heal or destroy on a global scale. We are, for the first time in our history, powerful enough to end ourselves. This is what the Anunnaki story is really about, not God's power. And what happens when power is not balanced by wisdom? The ancient scribes did not write about their gods as flawless beings. They wrote about them as rulers who made terrible mistakes. They flooded the world, they poisoned the land, they abandoned their cities, they fought wars that nearly wiped out their own creation. In the end, they stepped away, not because everything was fixed, but because they could no longer control what they had made, and that is a lesson that echoes far beyond Mesopotamia. Every civilization reaches a point where it must decide whether to dominate or to nurture, whether to destroy or to protect, whether to cling to power or to let go. The Anunnaki reached that point. Now humanity is approaching it too. We are beginning to create artificial minds. We are beginning to alter life itself. We are beginning to explore other worlds. We are becoming what ancient people once imagined gods to be, and that should make us pause. Because the Sumerian story warns us what happens when creators lose control of their creations. The Igigi rebelled. Humanity became too numerous. The system collapsed and the world burned. The ancient tablets are not just about what happened long ago. They are about what always happens when intelligence, ambition, and power collide. The cycle repeats, but it does not have to. This is where the story offers a quiet, hopeful possibility. Enki, the god who chose compassion over control. The god who saved humanity when the others wanted it destroyed. The god who believed that creation was worth protecting even when it was flawed. Whether Enki was real or symbolic, he represents a choice to nurture rather than annihilate, a choice to guide rather than dominate, a choice to let life grow. That is the choice humanity now faces. We can build a future that is sustainable, just, and creative, or we can repeat the mistakes of the gods and tear ourselves apart. The Anunnaki story does not tell us which path we will take. It only shows us what happens when the wrong one is chosen. And that is why this story has survived for over 5,000 years, because it is not just about ancient Mesopotamia. It is about every civilization that rises high enough to see its own reflection in the sky. And as we look out into the universe, searching for other worlds, other life, other intelligences, we should remember the clay tablets of Sumer. They tell us that being advanced does not mean being wise, that having power does not mean knowing how to use it, and that even gods can make mistakes. So as we close this long journey through ancient text and modern thought, remember this. The Anunnaki may have left, but their story did not. It lives in our myths. It lives in our fears. It lives in our dreams of the stars. And perhaps, most importantly, it lives in our choices. Because whether the gods were real or not, the responsibility they once carried now belongs to us. And what we do with it will determine whether the future becomes another golden age or another lament. The clay tablets are silent now, but their message still speaks, and it is asking us, just as it asked the gods long ago, what kind of creators will we be? And that question hangs in the air, heavier than any ancient curse, heavier than any divine decree ever pressed into clay. What kind of creators will we be? To truly understand why this question matters so much, we have to go back one last time, not to the myths, not to the gods, but to the people who wrote them. The Sumerians were not naive primitives. They were engineers, astronomers, accountants, lawmakers, and historians. They recorded grain shipments and eclipses with the same seriousness that they recorded divine wars. Their worldview did not separate the sacred from the practical. To them, the gods were part of reality, not fantasy. When they wrote that Enlil ordered destruction, they meant that something with supreme authority decided that destruction should happen. When they wrote that Enki defied that order, they meant that someone with immense power chose to disobey. When they wrote that the gods left their cities, they meant that those in control withdrew. The language is divine, but the structure is political. This is why the story feels so strangely modern. Because stripped of divine names and celestial imagery, what remains is a story about rulers, systems, rebellion, collapse, and the consequences of unchecked power. The Anunnaki were in every meaningful way a ruling class. They controlled resources, they controlled labor, they controlled law, they controlled knowledge. Humanity was dependent on them. And when that dependency became unstable, everything fell apart. This is not just ancient history. It is a warning that repeats across time. Empires rise, they grow complex, they become centralized, they depend on systems that no one fully understands, and when those systems fail, the collapse is catastrophic. The Sumerians experienced this at the hands of their gods. We risk experiencing it at the hands of our own creations. Because just as humanity once depended on the Anunnaki, we are beginning to depend on systems that are becoming too large, too fast, and too powerful to control. Artificial intelligence, global finance. Climate systems, weapons of mass destruction. These are our gods now. They shape our lives. They make decisions for us. They determine who thrives and who suffers. And like the Anunnaki, they were created to serve, but they are becoming something else. This is why the ancient story refuses to die, because it mirrors our own trajectory with terrifying accuracy. The Sumerians wrote that the gods created humans to do the work. Today we create machines to do ours. The Sumerians wrote that the gods grew afraid of how numerous and powerful humans had become. Today we fear how powerful our own creations may become. The Sumerians wrote of a great catastrophe when control was lost. Today we stand on the edge of one. Whether or not the Anunnaki were literal beings, the pattern is real. Creation, dependence, overreach, collapse, and then something new emerges from the ruins. After the gods withdrew, humanity did not vanish. It adapted, it rebuilt. It created something new. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, civilization continued, but it was never the same. The old world where gods ruled directly was gone forever, and that loss is still felt in the ancient texts. The Lamentations are not just about cities. They are about a world that can never be recovered. A time when the universe felt ordered, when power had a face, when meaning was given from above. After the gods left, humanity had to find meaning for itself. And that is where religion, philosophy, and law truly begin, not as obedience to gods who walk the earth, but as systems to govern ourselves. In that sense, the Anunnaki did something extraordinary. They forced humanity to grow up. Whether by accident or design, their departure ended the age of divine rule and began the age of human responsibility. And now, thousands of years later, we are standing at the threshold of another such transition. We are no longer just a species struggling to survive. We are a planetary force. We are changing the climate. We are altering genomes. We are reaching beyond Earth. We are becoming creators. And that means the old story is more relevant than ever, because the question that destroyed the world of the Anunnaki is now ours to answer. How do you treat what you create? Do you see it as a tool, a servant, a disposable resource? Or do you see it as something that deserves care, protection, and the chance to grow? The Anunnaki made their choice. Some of them chose control, some chose destruction, one chose preservation. The result was war, catastrophe, and withdrawal. The result was a world scarred by their conflict. We do not have to repeat that. That is the real message hidden in the clay tablets, not that gods once ruled the earth, but that power, when separated from compassion, always leads to ruin. So whether you see this story as myth, memory, or metaphor, it is speaking to us across 5,000 years with the same quiet urgency. Be careful what you create. Be careful how you rule. Be careful what you destroy. Because every civilization, no matter how advanced, is only one bad decision away from becoming a lament. And somewhere in a museum vault, in a dark drawer on a piece of clay pressed by hands long turned to dust, the Sumerians are still whispering that truth. They are telling us what happened when their gods failed, and they are asking us not to make the same mistake. And that is where this chapter of the story closes, not with answers, but with a warning. And so the final echo of this story does not fade into silence. It lingers, it waits. It asks us to look at ourselves with the same intensity that the ancient scribes once looked at their gods. Because when all the layers of myth, metaphor, history, and speculation are peeled away, one truth remains. Civilizations fall when they forget who they are responsible to. The Sumerians believed they were responsible to the Anunnaki. When those gods left, humanity had to become responsible to itself. And now, standing on the edge of a future shaped by technology, climate, and interstellar ambition, we are once again at a point where the stakes are no less than the survival of our species. The Anunnaki story is not just ancient history, it is a mirror. Let us walk through that mirror one last time. Imagine the world of early Sumer, the first cities rising from mud and reeds, irrigation canals carved by human hands, temples towering over the flat plains, people living not in small tribes but in dense, organized societies for the first time in human history. And above all of it, the gods, they were not invisible. They had houses, they had estates, they had servants, they had bureaucracies. To the Sumerians, this was not fantasy. It was the world as it existed. Now imagine what it must have felt like when the gods left, when the temples became empty, when the rituals continued but the presence was gone, when prayers went unanswered, when the disasters came and there was no divine protection. That sense of abandonment echoes through the Lamentations like a scream frozen in time. My city has been destroyed, my God has left, the storm has come. This is not poetic exaggeration, this is trauma. And trauma leaves scars that last longer than any empire. It changes how a culture sees the universe. It changes how it understands power, and it changes how it tells stories. After the fall of Sumer, gods never again ruled so directly. They became more distant, more abstract, more symbolic. The idea of gods walking among humans faded into memory. In its place arose something new, religion. Not as the management of divine estates, but as the search for meaning in a world where the gods no longer answer. The Anunnaki era ended, the human era began, and that transition is one of the most important moments in our species' history, because it is the moment we were forced to grow beyond dependency. We had to create our own laws, our own systems, our own ethics. We could no longer rely on divine rulers to fix what was broken. We had to do it ourselves. That is the true inheritance of the Anunnaki, not technology, not bloodlines, not ancient secrets, but responsibility. And now, thousands of years later, that responsibility has reached a new level. We are no longer just shaping our own societies. We are shaping the entire biosphere. We are altering the chemistry of the atmosphere. We are driving species to extinction. We are building machines that can think. We are touching the fabric of life itself. We are doing things that ancient people would have described as divine. And that means the ancient warning is more relevant than ever. Power without wisdom destroys. Creation without care leads to catastrophe. The Anunnaki made their choices. They paid the price. We are now standing at the same crossroads. Whether the gods of Sumer were real or not, their story is a map of what happens when a civilization reaches too far, too fast, without understanding the consequences. And that is why this story refuses to stay buried. It keeps resurfacing in UFO sightings, in ancient astronaut theories, in myths of lost golden ages, in our fear of artificial intelligence. All of these are modern expressions of the same ancient anxiety. What if there is something more powerful than us? What if it controls us? What if it leaves us? And what if we become it? Because that last question is the most unsettling of all. We are becoming the Anunnaki. We are the ones creating new forms of intelligence. We are the ones deciding which species survive. We are the ones shaping the future of this planet. And one day, if we reach the stars, we will be the ones who descend on other worlds. We will be the gods in someone else's myths. So the story of the Anunnaki is not just about what happened long ago. It is about what will happen again. The only difference is that this time we will be the ones making the decisions. And the ancient scribes are still watching us in their own way, through the words they left behind, through the warnings they preserved, through the stories of gods who forgot their responsibility and paid the price. So as this long narration draws toward its final chapters, remember this. You do not need to believe in ancient astronauts to learn from the Anunnaki. You do not need to think gods walked the earth to understand the lesson. All you need to do is look at what happens when power is divorced from compassion. When rulers forget those they rule, when creators see their creations as expendable, the result is always the same: collapse, and from collapse, survivors will always try to remember. That is what the Sumerians did. They wrote their pain into clay. They pressed their fears into stone. They told stories so powerful that they still haunt us 5,000 years later. And now their story has reached us, not as a relic, but as a warning, and perhaps as a gift. Because knowing what happened before gives us the chance to choose differently. And that, more than anything, is what makes us human. The gods may have left, and so the story continues, flowing forward like a great river that began in the mud-brick cities of Sumer and now runs straight through our own time. Because once you truly listen to what those ancient tablets are saying, you realize something profound. They are not obsessed with gods, they are obsessed with collapse. With what happens when a world that feels permanent suddenly shatters. With what it feels like to watch order turn into chaos, with what it means to survive when everything you thought was eternal disappears. The Anunnaki were not important because they were gods, they were important because they represented power. They were the ones who controlled the systems that kept the world running. When they fought, the world suffered. When they left, the world changed forever. And that pattern has never stopped repeating. Look at any great collapse in history: the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the fall of the Aztecs, the destruction of Baghdad, the Black Death, the world wars. Every time it feels the same. People believe their world will last forever, and then suddenly it doesn't. That is what the Sumerians lived through. They were not primitive people who invented myths for fun. They were people who saw the unthinkable happen. They saw cities erased. They saw land turn barren. They saw systems collapse. And they wrote it down. They told the story the only way they could understand it, through the language of gods. Because when forces larger than human armies destroy everything, people reach for divine explanations. But beneath the divine names is something deeply human. Fear, loss, confusion, grief. The laments are not religious poetry. They are trauma records. They are the voices of survivors saying, "This should not have happened. This was not supposed to end this way. Something went terribly wrong." That is why they still feel powerful, because anyone who has lived through a disaster recognizes that voice. And this is where the Anunnaki story truly becomes dangerous. Not because it suggests ancient aliens, but because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Civilization is fragile, no matter how advanced it becomes, no matter how powerful it grows, no matter how much it believes it has mastered nature. All it takes is the wrong combination of conflict, environment, and technology. And it can all fall apart. The Sumerians lived in a world that felt stable. They had irrigation, they had bureaucracy, they had writing, they had law, they had astronomy, they had gods, and then it all failed, not slowly, suddenly, and afterward nothing was the same. That is the part of the story we are meant to remember, not the flying gods, not the divine wars, but the collapse, because we are closer to that edge than we like to admit. Our civilization is more complex than any in history. Our systems are more interconnected, our technologies more powerful, our environmental impact greater. We are capable of miracles, and we are capable of annihilation, just like the gods of Sumer. And here is the darkest, strangest truth hidden in all of this. The Anunnaki story may not be about ancient beings at all. It may be about us. It may be a warning from the past about what happens when a civilization reaches a level of power that outpaces its wisdom. The gods created humans to work. We create machines to work. The gods feared humanity's growth. We fear our own technologies. The gods unleashed disasters they could not control. We are doing the same with climate and weapons. The gods withdrew after the damage was done. What will we do? That is the unanswered question. The tablets do not tell us how to avoid the fate of Sumer. They only show us what it looked like when it happened, and perhaps that is enough. Because once you have seen what collapse looks like, you cannot unsee it. The cities in the Laments were once vibrant, the temples were full, the canals were flowing, the markets were busy, and then they became ruins, just like so many cities we see in the archaeological record today. Pompeii, Angkor, Teotihuacan, Mohenjo-Daro, every one of them was once a living world. Now they are stone and dust. The Sumerians were just the first to write that story down. And in doing so, they gave us something priceless: memory. Because civilizations that remember collapse have a chance to avoid repeating it. Those that forget are doomed to walk the same path again. And so this long narration, this journey through gods and wars and ancient tablets, leads us not to the past, but to the future. Because whether or not the Anunnaki were real beings, their story is a reminder that power always carries consequences. And the more powerful a civilization becomes, the more devastating those consequences can be. We stand at a moment in history where we have more power than any generation before us. We can alter the climate, we can destroy the planet, we can create new forms of life, we can explore other worlds. We are becoming something ancient people would have called gods, and that is exactly why we need their story. Not because it tells us where we came from, but because it warns us about where we might be going. The Anunnaki's world ended. Ours does not have to, but only if we listen, only if we remember, only if we choose a different path than the gods of Sumer did. And that is where this part of the story rests, not in ancient ruins, not in museum vaults, but in us. Because we are the ones who will decide how the next chapter of civilization is written, and whether future generations will one day write their own laments about us. And so we keep going, not because the story demands it, but because something inside us does. Because whenever humanity stumbles upon the ruins of a lost civilization, whether it is Sumer or the Maya or the great cities buried under jungle and sand, we feel a strange, almost aching curiosity. What happened here? Why did it end? Could it happen to us? The Sumerians asked the same questions, only they believed the answers lay with the gods. But even if the Anunnaki were not literal beings, their story preserved something real, the experience of sudden, overwhelming collapse. And collapse always feels divine to those who endure it. When earthquakes strike, when plagues spread, when droughts destroy crops, when wars erase entire cities, it feels like something beyond human control is at work. The Sumerians did not have modern science, but they had memory. They had records, they had witnesses. And they knew that their world had ended once before, not metaphorically. Literally, The old order was gone, the gods had left, the cities were in ruins, and a new world had to be built from the wreckage. That is the part of the story that modern people often miss. Sumer did not simply fade away, it was broken, and what replaced it was something fundamentally different. A world without direct divine rule, a world where humans were responsible for themselves. A world where power was no longer guaranteed by heaven. That transition was traumatic. It shook their entire understanding of reality, and trauma has a way of encoding itself in story. That is why the Anunnaki are not gentle gods, they are not kind creators. They are volatile, political, angry, and flawed. They behave like rulers under stress, because that is what they represent, a ruling system that collapsed, and the people who survived tried to make sense of it. They did not say our empire fell, they said the gods fought. They did not say our environment collapsed, they said the storm of Enlil came. They did not say our political order failed, they said the gods abandoned us. And in a way they were right, because when a system that controls everything suddenly stops working, it feels like divine abandonment. Today we do the same thing. When financial systems crash, we say the market betrayed us. When climate disasters strike, we speak of nature's wrath. When technology fails, we feel helpless. We still personify forces we cannot control. We still speak the language of gods even when we call them something else. And that is why the Anunnaki story will never truly disappear, because it is not about ancient gods. It is about how humans understand power when it overwhelms them. And the deeper you go into the ancient texts, the more you see this. The gods argue, they form councils. They issue decrees, they punish rebellion. They manage labor, they regulate population, they worry about resources, they fight over territory, they control infrastructure, they withdraw when it becomes too costly to stay. These are not supernatural concerns, these are political ones. The Anunnaki are not spiritual beings floating in clouds, they are administrators of a system. And when that system failed, the world burned. This is why the catastrophe around 2000 BCE is so important. Because it marks the end of that system. After that, there is no more talk of gods ruling cities directly. No more divine kings with impossibly long reigns. No more temples functioning as literal estates of living gods. Everything becomes symbolic. Ritual replaces presence, prayer replaces command, faith replaces direct rule. The gods became distant, the human world began, and we have been living in that world ever since. But here is the haunting possibility that the ancient texts leave open. What if the gods did not just become distant? What if they left? What if whatever once held that system together is gone? That idea is terrifying, not because it means ancient aliens flew away, but because it means there is no higher authority to save us from ourselves, no Enki to warn us, no divine counsel to intervene, no higher power to reset the world. We are on our own. And that realization is what the Sumerians were struggling with. They went from a world where gods were present to one where gods were silent. They had to learn how to live without them. We are still doing the same thing. Modern society is built on systems that function like gods. They are powerful, they are complex, they are beyond the understanding of any single person. They shape our lives, and when they fail, we suffer. But there is no divine being to fix them, only us. So perhaps the true legacy of the Anunnaki is not that they once ruled the earth, but that they taught us what it feels like when rulers fail, when the gods fall, when the sky stops answering, when the world must be rebuilt by human hands. And that is why their story is so strangely comforting, because it reminds us that collapse is not the end. The Sumerians survived, humanity continued, civilization was reborn, different but alive. The gods left, but humans remained. And in the end, that may be the most important truth hidden in all those ancient tablets. No matter how powerful the gods were, no matter how devastating the war, no matter how terrible the catastrophe humanity endured. And so will we, as long as we remember, as long as we learn, as long as we choose a different path than the gods of Sumer did. And that is where this part of the journey comes to rest, not in despair, but in the quiet, stubborn hope that even after the fall of gods, the story of humanity goes on. And so the river of this story keeps flowing, carrying with it not just the memory of ancient gods, but the deeper truth about what it means to be human in a universe that does not promise us safety. Because at the heart of the Anunnaki narrative, beneath all the divine names and cosmic imagery, there is something profoundly intimate. Fear of being alone, fear of being abandoned, fear of having to face an uncertain future without a higher power to guide us. The Sumerians believed their gods had left. We still wrestle with the same idea today. When disasters strike, when systems fail, when injustice reigns, people ask the same ancient question. Where are the gods, and if there are none, then who is responsible? That is the terrifying beauty of the Anunnaki story. It shows us the moment humanity realized the universe might not be watching. The moment when people understood that even gods can fail, leave, or die. And that realization changes everything. It is the birth of existential awareness, the awareness that we are alone, that our fate is in our own hands, and that no one is coming to save us. The Sumerians stood at that edge 5,000 years ago. We stand there again now, but unlike them, we have something they never did. We have science, we have global communication, we have the ability to see the entire planet as one fragile system. We have the power to either protect it or destroy it. In a strange way, we are more godlike than the Anunnaki ever were, and that should humble us, because power without humility is what destroyed their world. The flood was an act of desperation. The wars of the gods were acts of pride. The withdrawal was an act of exhaustion, and the ruins they left behind were the cost. The Sumerians tried to make sense of it. They did not blame themselves, they blamed the gods. But in doing so, they preserved the story of what happens when power turns inward and tears itself apart. And now that story has reached us, not as a myth, not as a fantasy, but as a warning encoded in the oldest written words humanity possesses. We can ignore it, we can dismiss it, we can laugh at it, but we cannot say we were never told. Every age has its Anunnaki. For the Sumerians, it was divine beings in temples. For us, it is corporations, governments, algorithms, and technologies that shape the world beyond any single person's control. They decide who has food, who has water, who has power, who survives, and when they fail, the consequences are just as devastating as any ancient curse. The Anunnaki did not have to be aliens to be dangerous. They just had to be powerful. That is the lesson. And so, as this narration stretches toward its final moments, let us step away from the gods for a moment and look at ourselves. We are the inheritors of a broken world. We are the children of collapse. We live on a planet that has survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, and mass extinctions. We are part of a long story of survival. The Sumerians were part of that story. They lived through one of its great turning points, and they left us their testimony. Not in stone monuments, but in clay tablets, fragile, human, enduring. Those tablets do not tell us that gods will save us. They tell us that even gods can fail, and if that is true, then the responsibility is ours, to build systems that do not collapse under their own weight, to create technologies that do not destroy their creators, to choose cooperation over domination, to choose care over control. Because if we do not, then one day, far in the future, someone may dig up the ruins of our cities and wonder what happened. They may tell stories about us. They may invent myths. They may say that we were gods and that we destroyed ourselves, just as the Sumerians once said about the Anunnaki. And that would be the greatest tragedy of all, not that gods fell, but that humans failed to learn from them. And that is where this part of the story fades, leaving us not with answers, but with a responsibility we cannot escape. And now we come to the end of this long journey, not the end of the mystery, but the end of this telling of it. From the first cities of Sumer to the fall of from the wars of the Anunnaki to the silence that followed, we have walked through a story that has haunted humanity for more than 5,000 years. A story carved into clay by people who watched their world collapse and tried to preserve what it felt like so no one would ever forget. They lived in a time when gods walked among humans, or at least when power felt so overwhelming that it could only be described as divine. They watched that power turn against itself. They watched their cities burn. They watched their land turn barren. They watched their protectors disappear. And they wrote it all down, not as fiction, not as fantasy, but as memory. Whether you believe the Anunnaki were literal beings from the stars, advanced rulers of a lost age, or symbolic representations of ancient power systems, the heart of the story remains the same. A great civilization rose, it became powerful, it lost control, and it collapsed. The Sumerians did not survive because their god saved them. They survived because they adapted, they rebuilt. They learned to live in a world where the heavens were silent, and that is why their story still speaks to us. Because we too are living in an age of overwhelming power, we shape the planet, we create new forms of intelligence, we command forces that can heal or annihilate. We are closer than ever to becoming what ancient people once called gods, and that is why the Anunnaki story matters. It is not about who ruled the earth long ago. It is about what happens when rulers forget their responsibility. It is about what happens when creation becomes disposable. It is about what happens when power is not guided by wisdom. The gods of Sumer made their choices. They paid the price. Humanity inherited the world that remained. Now the next chapter belongs to us. We can build a future that honors life, balance, and care, or we can repeat the mistakes of the gods and write our own laments into the ruins of tomorrow. The clay tablets cannot decide that for us. They can only warn us, and that is what they have done. The Anunnaki's final war, whether myth, memory, or something stranger, was not the end of humanity. It was the beginning of human responsibility, and that responsibility is still here. It is here in every choice we make, in every system we build, in every technology we unleash, in every future we imagine. So the story does not truly end here. It continues in us. If you made it all the way through this journey, you are part of this story now too. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Anunnaki, ancient Sumer, and the mysteries of humanity's forgotten past, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think about this story, and most importantly, tell me where in the world you are watching from. Because just like the ancient scribes who once pressed their memories into clay, we are all connected across time and space, sharing this mystery together.